Welcome back. I was proofreading a story this week about a man who was abandoned, not once, but twice, for the same woman, for the same man. What held my attention was not the wound, it was the architecture of the silence that followed, the way he built and waited and said nothing. You're watching his eternal diary.
The morning of Ethan Mercer's third wedding smelled like cold stone and cedar, not flowers. He had requested no flowers inside the venue, a converted 1920s railway depot in the financial district, all exposed iron and reclaimed timber, the kind of space that asked nothing of you except your attention. The caterers had brought white orchids anyway, because caterers always think they know better. And Ethan had stood at the entrance for 4 minutes watching them arrange the centerpieces before quietly instructing his coordinator, Priya, to have every arrangement replaced with bare branch configurations and ivory candles. Low, simple, geometric. Nothing that could be misread as sentiment. It was 6:47 a.m. The ceremony wasn't until 2. Burned. He stood at the floor-to-ceiling window of the bridal suite. They'd given him the bridal suite because the groom's room was being used as a staging area for the caterers, a mix-up that Priya had apologized for 3 times. And he drank his coffee black, watching the city wake up below him. 14 stories down, a sanitation truck made its slow, grinding route along Calloway Street. A woman in a yellow coat walked a dog the size of a small horse. A bike courier cut through a red light and didn't look back. Ordinary things. He had learned to love ordinary things. At 36, Ethan Mercer was a man who understood, with the quiet certainty of someone who has been burned to the foundation and rebuilt himself twice over, that ordinary things were the only things worth protecting. Not the spectacular ones, not the ones that gleam and demand attention and make you feel like your life is finally a movie worth watching. Those were the things that destroyed you. Those were the things that smiled at you with borrowed teeth. He had learned this the hard way. He had learned this from Vivien. His phone buzzed on the window ledge. A message from his best man, Lachlan, who was likely still in his hotel room 2 floors down, probably still wearing last night's shirt. "You good? Tell me you slept." Ethan typed back, "I slept." He had not slept. But there was no point in broadcasting that particular truth on the morning of your wedding. Some things you carry in the chest, quiet, like a stone in a deep pocket. He looked at his reflection in the glass. The man looking back at him was not the man he had been at 26 or at 30. The man at 26 had been lean and bright-eyed, and fatally in love with a woman who wore her beauty like a weapon she hadn't yet decided to draw. The man at 30 had been hollowed, rebuilt around a grief he didn't have the vocabulary for, and then hollowed again when the same woman returned, and he, idiotically, had let her. The man at 36 was different. He had cheekbones now that came from the kind of discipline that isn't about vanity. He had a stillness in his eyes that some people read as coldness, and others read as depth, and he had stopped caring which interpretation they chose. He wore his suits the way a surgeon wears gloves, functional, precise, without affect. His hair was darker than it had been in his 20s, touched at the temples with a gray that he had decided 2 years ago to simply allow. He looked like someone who had survived something and declined to explain it, which was accurate. The depot venue was his idea. Celeste had wanted something in the hills, a vineyard or one of those converted estates with the original stonework and the views that photographers loved. He hadn't argued. He had simply said, one evening over dinner at the kitchen table of the apartment they'd shared for 8 months, "I want somewhere that feels real to me, industrial, honest." And she had looked at him for a long moment. Celeste always looked at him a beat longer than other people, like she was reading past the sentence to the paragraph underneath, and she had said, "Okay, show me what you mean." He had loved her for that. For the okay, and then the genuine effort to understand. Celeste Huang was a forensic accountant. She had a laugh that arrived without warning and a habit of underlining things in her case files with 4 different colors of ink. She made excellent congee on Sunday mornings and was completely indifferent to the opinion of strangers. She had met Ethan at a financial litigation seminar where he'd been presenting a session on asset protection structures in contested estate law, and she had raised her hand at the end and asked a question so precise and layered that he'd had to pause and genuinely think before answering. He hadn't paused for a question in years. He had found her number in the seminar register and texted her 2 days later. "The answer to your question required a 17-page memorandum. I'll buy you coffee while I summarize." She had replied, "Make it lunch. I charge by the hour, and your summary better be worth it." He had smiled at his phone like a man who'd forgotten he could. That had been 14 months ago. 14 months of slow, careful, deliberate accumulation. Not the lightning strike version of love that had destroyed him twice. This was the other kind. The kind that builds itself from honesty and friction and the specific comfort of being known. He had not rushed it. He had, in fact, been almost annoyingly methodical about it. In the way of a man who has had his foundations knocked out and now tests every plank before he steps on it. Celeste had not minded, or rather, she had minded, occasionally, and told him so directly, which was exactly the thing that made him trust her. He finished his coffee, set the cup on the window ledge, checked the time. 6:59 a.m. And then his coordinator, Priya, knocked twice on the suite door and opened it without waiting, which was her habit, and one he'd never corrected because he respected efficiency. And she said, in the tone of a woman who delivers news the way a scalpel delivers incisions, "There's a woman downstairs. She says she knows you. She doesn't have an invitation." Ethan did not turn from the window immediately. He let 4 seconds pass, watching a pigeon land on the ledge outside and then take off again, startled by something. "Description," he said. "Dark hair, green coat. She gave her name as Vivien Hale." He turned then. Not because he was surprised. He was not surprised. He had, in fact, spent the better part of 3 years understanding, with the cold mathematical certainty that comes from knowing a person's psychology better than they know it themselves, that this was a possibility he needed to have planned for. He was not surprised, but there was something in his chest, a pressure, not quite pain. More like the sensation of pressing a thumb against an old scar to confirm it has properly healed. It had. He pressed, and it held. "Tell her I'll be down in 15 minutes, he said. Priya's expression shifted by approximately 2 millimeters, the professional equivalent of alarm. "Ethan, the ceremony starts at 2. It's 7 a.m. I have time." He reached for his jacket, draped over the armchair in the corner. "Don't tell Celeste." Priya looked at him. Then she made the expression of someone who has signed an NDA and intended to honor it. 15 minutes, she confirmed, and left. Ethan put on his jacket, looked at himself in the mirror above the antique console near the door. Not for vanity, for calibration. He looked like a man in complete control of the morning. He looked like someone who had been waiting. To understand what happened at the depot on the morning of Ethan Mercer's 3rd wedding, you have to go back to the summer he was 26, to a studio apartment on the 6th floor of a building that smelled of old carpet and other people's cooking, to the moment he first understood what it felt like to organize your entire life around a single person and then watch that person reorganize themselves around someone else. He had met Vivien Hale at an architecture firm where he was an associate, and she was a client liaison for a development company that had contracted them for a waterfront project. She had walked into the conference room on a Thursday afternoon in late June with a folder under her arm and a way of moving through space that made the room feel like it had been rearranged specifically for her arrival. He had noticed her the way you notice a shift in air pressure. Not consciously, at first. Ding. Just a kind of recalibration. They had sat across from each other for a 2-hour meeting about zoning variances and load-bearing specifications. And she had asked questions that were precise and occasionally surprising, and he had answered them without showing that he was also cataloging the way she held a pen and the particular quality of her attention when something genuinely interested her. Afterward, in the elevator, she had said, "The cantilevered section on the east face. The away. It'll shadow the lower units by 3 p.m. in winter. Did anyone model that?" He had modeled it. Nobody else had caught it. "I'll adjust the design," he'd said. She had looked at him with those green eyes that were neither warm nor cold, but precisely level, like water in a glass someone is about to carry, and said, "Good." That was the beginning. They dated for 8 months, which for Ethan felt like 8 years, not because of boredom, but because of density. Everything felt significant. Every conversation felt like a layer being added to something permanent. He was not a man given to melodrama, even then, but he recognized, with the rational clarity that was always his dominant mode, that he was building his future around her, and she seemed to be building too. She laughed at his observations. She challenged his assumptions. She showed up at his apartment on a Wednesday with takeout containers and the specific kind of ease that signals that a person has decided your space is also their space. He had asked her to move in. She had said yes. They had looked at apartments, had narrowed it to 2, had a discussion about the one in the river district with the good natural light. And then Damian Cole had appeared. He appeared the way these men always appear in retrospect, gradually and then everywhere. A friend of a colleague of Vivien's, someone she mentioned first in the abstract, someone who showed up at a party Ethan attended but left early, someone whose name began to surface with a frequency that a person with Ethan's analytical mind would eventually notice, if they were paying attention, which Ethan always was. He had paid attention and said nothing, because he believed in evidence, not inference. Because he was not the kind of man who makes accusations out of pattern recognition, without concrete data. Because he believed that if something was wrong, she would tell him. Because he loved her with the specific, credulous love of a person who has not yet learned that love is not, in fact, a sufficient safeguard against being hollowed out. The concrete data came on a Tuesday in March. He came home early from a site visit. A structural problem had been resolved faster than expected, and the apartment was empty, but for the kind of absence that has a particular texture, the texture of something recently present and hastily removed. There was a glass on the counter with lipstick on the rim. Not her color. Her color was the dark plum she wore in winter. This was a natural rose, the kind a woman wears when she's trying to look like she's wearing nothing. Vivien had come back an hour later, and he had been sitting at the kitchen table, not with anger, but with a stillness so complete that she had stopped in the doorway and looked at him the way you look at something that you suddenly realize is not what you thought it was. He had not shouted. He had not broken anything. He had asked 3 questions, precisely. Was it Damian? How long? What do you want to do? She had answered, yes, 6 weeks, I don't know. He had said, then I'll make the decision for you and give you some time to figure it out. He had moved out the next morning. She had chosen Damian within the week. Ethan had moved into a studio that smelled of old carpet and sat on the edge of a mattress he'd bought from a discount warehouse and looked at the wall and tried to locate the specific thing inside him that had broken. He was 26. He had no vocabulary for the kind of grief that doesn't announce itself with tears, or the kind that simply reorders your internal architecture without asking your permission. He worked. He buried himself in specifications and site plans and the dense, beautiful logic of structural systems. He went to bed late and woke early and ate badly and did not speak about Vivien to anyone except Lachlan, who had known him since university and understood that the correct response to Ethan's grief was to show up with whiskey and say very little. He survived it. Over the following 18 months, he was rebuilt by work and time and the gradual unsexy accumulation of ordinary days. He moved to a better apartment. He got promoted. He started doing more complex projects, the kind that required understanding not just the architectural side, but the legal and financial architecture underneath, zoning laws, easement disputes, title complications. He began to spend his evenings reading real estate law with the focused appetite of someone who has realized that the map they'd been using was missing entire territories. He was 28 when he met Sienna. Sienna Walsh was a graphic designer with a brightness to her that he found genuinely warming, the way a lamp in a room you've spent too long in the dark can feel like rescue. She was uncomplicated in the best sense, not shallow but clear. What she felt, she expressed. What she wanted. "Eat," she said. There was no subtext with Sienna, no reading between lines, and after Vivien's layers within layers, this was a relief so profound it nearly felt like joy. They were together for a year and 8 months. They got engaged in the fall, and the engagement was genuine and warm, and he believed, with the sort of careful, measured belief he was capable of, that he was doing the right thing. The wedding was set for a Saturday in September. On a Wednesday 2 weeks before the ceremony, Sienna called him from a gas station off the interstate and said very quietly that she couldn't do it, that she had tried, that she had loved him genuinely, but that somewhere in the last few months she had realized she was in love with someone she'd grown up with, a man named Patrick, who had come back into her life at a reunion, and she hadn't known how to stop it. She was sorry. She was devastated. She was also clearly calling from outside because she needed the physical space to say what she was saying. Ethan had sat in his car in the parking structure at work and listened to the faint sound of traffic through the phone and said very quietly, "Are you safe?" She had said yes, that Patrick was a good person, that she hadn't, that nothing had. "I know," he said. "I'm not asking about that. I'm asking if you're physically safe right now. It's late." She had made a sound that was either a sob or a laugh, or both, and said, "God, Ethan, yes, I'm safe. Why are you—" "Good," he said. "Drive carefully." And he had ended the call. That had been his second collapse. Different from the first in texture, not in the particular humiliation of betrayal, but in the specific, grinding desolation of having tried again and failed again, of wondering what it was in him that was deficient, what essential quality of personhood he lacked that made the women he loved choose, eventually, to go elsewhere. He did not cry this time either. He went home and sat in his kitchen and looked at the refrigerator, which still had a grocery list on it in Sienna's handwriting. Eggs, rice wine, the good vinegar, and he thought about what it meant to be 30 years old and twice abandoned and still somehow alive. Then he made coffee, and he started thinking. Not about Sienna, about Vivien. Mine. Because 2 days after the call from the gas station, he had received a message from Vivien Hale for the first time in 4 years. A simple message, 2 lines. She had heard what happened. She wanted him to know she was thinking of him, and if he ever wanted to talk, she was there. 2 days after his second engagement ended. 2 days. He had read the message 3 times. Then he had put his phone face down on the kitchen counter and finished his coffee. He had not replied. What he had done, instead, over the following days and weeks, was think very carefully about coincidence, about timing, about the specific way in which a person like Vivien operated. And what he arrived at, with the kind of cold, clear-eyed analysis that is only available to a person who has been grieving too long to be sentimental about it, was this. Vivien was a person who treated relationships as a portfolio. She diversified. She kept an eye on performance. And when one investment underperformed, she did not liquidate the entire portfolio. She rebalanced. She kept the underperforming asset parked, dormant, available for reactivation when the conditions changed. He was one of those assets. He had always been one of those assets. He had the first time been too young and too in love to understand this. The second time, And here was the thing that genuinely cost him. The thing he pressed against like that thumb against the scar. The second time had not been Sienna. The second time had been what came after Sienna. Because Vivien had waited, and she had watched, and when Sienna had walked out, Vivien had materialized with her two-line message and her offer of conversation, and her green eyes, and her particular quality of attention. And he had, after 3 weeks of silence, after several coffees, after dinners, after the slow, specific reconstruction of a familiarity that felt, God help him, like coming home, he had let her back in. That had been the second time Vivien left him for Damian Cole. Because that is what happened. They had been back together for 7 months. Vivien and Ethan version 2, the reconstructed model. And she had been present and warm, and, he had told himself, changed. People changed. People made mistakes and learned from them. He was not 26 anymore. He could see things more clearly. He could not see things clearly. He saw them through the filter of wanting, which is the least reliable optical instrument available to a human being. Damian Cole had apparently experienced some kind of professional reversal that resolved itself, because on an evening in February, Vivien had come home. She had moved in, which he could now see, in retrospect, with crystal clarity, had been the mistake, but he had wanted so badly to believe in the architecture, and she had told him that she and Damian had been in contact, and that she still had feelings for him, and that she couldn't pretend otherwise. Ethan had listened to this in the kitchen, standing at the counter, looking at the coffee machine. He had thought, of course. He had thought, I knew, I have always known. I have always been a person who knows and chooses not to act on the knowledge because acting on it makes the thing real. He had thought, never again. Not with anger. Not even with pain, really. The pain had metabolized into something else in the months of waiting that had followed his second engagement ending. It had become information. Vivien was information. And Ethan Mercer, who had spent the last 2 years reading legal texts with the focused appetite of someone rearranging their internal map, understood that information, properly used, was not a wound. It was a resource. She left. She went back to Damian. He let her go, this time with such precise, controlled stillness that she had looked at him on her way out with an expression that was not quite guilt and not quite confusion, but something adjacent to both. Like she had expected a reaction, and the absence of one disturbed her more than any reaction could have. That look, he would think about later. He catalogued it and stored it. Because here is what Ethan Mercer did in the 3 years that followed Vivien's second departure. He became quietly and without announcement someone she would never be able to touch, not through anger, not through vengeance in the theatrical, seething sense. He did not plot against her. He did not make calls or pull strings or engineer her downfall. He simply, and this was in its way the most methodical thing he had ever done, he simply built something she could not reach. He left architecture. Not entirely, but as a primary profession. He took the interest in real estate law that had been growing quietly in the margins of his work for 2 years, and he made it the center. He enrolled in a law program, the accelerated route for people with professional backgrounds and specific objectives. He passed the bar at 33. He specialized in estate and real estate law, specifically in the area of asset protection structures, trusts, holding companies, the complex, invisible architecture that wealthy people use to ensure that what they have built cannot be dismantled by outside forces, including the courts, including ex-spouses, including the particular legal mechanisms that people reach for when they believe they are entitled to what someone else has built. He built a practice. Small, precise, and within 2 years in significant demand because he was exceptionally good at it. And because the specific combination of his architectural background and his legal expertise gave him a way of seeing structural problems in a building, in a financial instrument, in a contested estate that very few people could match. He moved into a building in the financial district. An apartment on the 14th floor, with windows that ran floor to ceiling, and a view of the city that, on clear mornings, made you feel like you were outside the story looking down at it. He became damned, quietly, very comfortable. And he did one other thing, one very specific, deliberate, non-theatrical thing that he had understood, with the cold precision of a man who has read enough estate law to know how these situations eventually present themselves, was necessary. He structured everything, every asset he owned or would own, the apartment, the practice, his investment portfolio, to 2 pieces of commercial real estate he acquired over 3 years, was placed inside a precisely constructed network of legal entities. A domestic asset protection trust, established in a jurisdiction with the most favorable creditor protection laws. 2 holding LLCs. A family limited partnership that existed, technically, to hold his real estate assets, but which had been structured so that the general partner interest, the actual control, was held by a corporate entity that was itself wholly owned by the trust. To the outside world, Ethan Mercer owned very little. On paper, he was not a poor man, but he was not obviously a wealthy one either. What he owned, in legal reality, was a beneficial interest in a trust. And that trust had been established and funded at a time, 3 years prior to the present moment, when there was no existing or anticipated creditor claim against him, which under most state and federal law rendered it nearly impenetrable. He had done this not out of paranoia. He had done it because he was a professional who understood that legal vulnerability comes from visibility, and because he had spent 2 years watching clients discover, after the fact, that the assets they'd spent a lifetime building were exposed in ways they had not understood until it was too late. And because, in some quiet, methodical chamber of his mind, he understood that Vivien Hale would eventually return. Not because he wished for it, not because some part of him wanted the confrontation, but because he knew her. He knew the way she mapped her world. He knew that Damian Cole was not a stable, long-term investment. He had run due diligence on Cole 3 years ago, quietly. The kind of background that is available to anyone with a law license and the patience to read financial filings. And he knew that the development company Cole ran had debt structures that were, to a trained eye, quietly catastrophic. Not immediately, but eventually. He had simply made sure that when eventually arrived, he was ready. He was, on the morning of his 3rd wedding, looking down at Vivien Hale standing at the entrance of the converted railway depot in a green coat that was not cheap, but not what it had been either. And he was precisely as ready as he had intended to be. He found her in the side corridor near the freight entrance, which was where Priya had apparently directed her, with the instinct of a coordinator who has managed enough complicated days to know that uncertain guests require containment. The corridor was narrow and industrial, and no, painted utility gray, lit by fluorescent strips that gave everything a slightly underwater quality. There was a stack of empty catering crates near the far wall, and a fire extinguisher in a red housing, and the faint smell of cold concrete, and whatever cleaning product the maintenance staff had used the previous evening. Vivien stood at the far end with her hands in the pockets of the green coat. She looked like herself. The specific herself that he had always found most difficult. The one who existed when the performance was stripped away, and what remained was just the person, which was still, even now, genuinely beautiful and slightly untethered, like something that had not quite found its moorings. She looked thinner than he remembered, not unhealthily so, but with the particular thinness that comes from sustained stress rather than intention. She had not seen him yet. She was looking at the floor, and there was a quality to her stillness that was different from the stillness he'd known, less controlled, more like a person who has run a long way and stopped, and is not entirely sure what they have been running toward. He walked the length of the corridor, His footsteps were quiet on the concrete, but she heard him at 10 feet and looked up. She looked at him the way you look at something that is more and different from what you expected. He registered the look, filed it, did not let it reach his expression. "Ethan," she said. Her voice was the same, lower than you expected from looking at her, with a clarity that could be read as confidence or as a person who had spent years managing how they were perceived. "Vivien." She seemed for a moment to be searching for the right place to start. Her eyes moved over his face with the specific attention of someone taking inventory. "You look well," she said. "Thank you. You're getting married?" "Yes." A pause. She shifted her weight slightly. "Today?" "Also yes." She made a sound that was not quite a laugh. "I wasn't sure you'd come down." "I considered it," he said, "but I wanted to see you." The admission seemed to startle her slightly, not because of its warmth, which it contained none of, but because of its directness. She had expected more performance from him, more coldness or more distance, not simple, declarative fact. "How did you know where I was?" he asked. "Lachlan. He mentioned it a while ago. I think he didn't realize." "He knew," Ethan said. "Lachlan doesn't say anything by accident." She absorbed this. Then, "Can we talk?" "We are talking." She looked at the corridor, the gray walls, the fluorescent light. "Not like this. This is the only version available today." He put his hands in his jacket pockets, which was not a casual gesture but a structural one, the posture of someone who has arranged themselves in a position that costs them nothing. "What did you want to say, Vivien?" She had been preparing something. He could tell because the way her expression shifted was not spontaneous. It had the slight quality of rehearsed material making contact with an unexpected audience. But what she said, when she found it, was quiet enough to be real. Damien's company collapsed. "I know." A beat. "You know." "I read the financial press." Cole Capital Development had filed for protection 8 months ago. The debt structure Ethan had identified in his private due diligence 3 years prior had, as projected, proven unsustainable. The company had over-leveraged on a development cycle that coincided with a credit tightening event, and the resulting shortfall had cascaded through their portfolio in the way that improperly structured debt always cascades, not all at once, but in the specific, grinding, incremental way of a wall whose foundation has been quietly compromised for years. Damien Cole had lost most of what he'd built. Not all. He was not a man without resources, but enough. Enough to change the texture of the life he'd been building, and the life that Vivien had been building alongside it. "He's gone," she said. Her voice was neutral in the particular way of someone who has been through the emotional temperature of a situation so many times that the words themselves have been abraded smooth. He's not gone, but it's over. Has been for a while." She paused. "I'm not here because of that. Tell me why you're here." She looked at him directly then, and there it was, the quality he had always found hardest to defend against, the thing that had undone him twice. The specific, unadorned honesty that she produced rarely and usually at the worst possible times. When she was not managing her image, when she dropped the particular careful control of a beautiful person who has learned to use their beauty strategically, so she could look at you and produce something that felt like truth. "Because I made the wrong choice," she said. "Twice. And I knew it both times. And I made it anyway." He looked at her. The fluorescent light hummed above them. "Yes," he said. "You did." "Ethan, I'm not disputing the statement. You're accurate." Something in her expression flickered. "I don't want to fight." "We're not fighting." "Then what are we doing?" He considered the question with the unhurried attention he gave most things, Outside, through the narrow window near the ceiling, he could hear the city continuing its ordinary morning. A distant horn, the compression hiss of a bus, the world operating with complete indifference to the specific drama of this fluorescent corridor. "We're having a conversation that should have happened years ago," he said, "but couldn't. Because you weren't ready to have it, and I wasn't ready to be the audience for it." Her chin moved slightly, the micro-expression of someone absorbing a precise strike. "And now? Now I'm ready. I'm also getting married in approximately 7 hours, so the conversation has a natural boundary." She looked away briefly, then back. "Who is she?" "You're asking the wrong question. What's the right question?" "The right question," he said, "is whether anything you came here to say would actually change anything." The silence stretched between them, and he watched her inhabit it. She was still very good at this, at occupying silences without filling them nervously. It was one of the things he had loved about her once. Now he observed it with the detached appreciation of someone who no longer has skin in the game. "I wanted to apologize," she said finally. "I wanted you to know that I understand what I did. It's what I kept doing." "Okay. Okay." She repeated it flatly. "It's appreciated," he said. "Genuinely, but appreciation is the extent of what I have for it." "I'm not asking for anything." "Yes, you are," he said. Not unkindly. As a statement of fact, the way you state a structural calculation. Not anything specific, necessarily. But people who travel to someone's wedding to deliver an apology are not merely delivering an apology. They're testing the density of what they broke, seeing if there's material left. She looked at him with something that was close to hurt, and also underneath close to respect. "You're very different," he said. "Yes." "I was going to say clear." "That too." Another pause. She reached into her coat pocket and then seemed to think better of whatever the gesture was. "Are you happy?" she asked. The question was simple and almost colorless. The way a very direct question can be when it has been stripped of the expectation of a particular answer. He thought about Celeste upstairs in their room. He'd told Priya to have them moved, bride and groom, protocol be damned. Probably awake. Probably reading through case files she'd brought in her tote bag because she was constitutionally incapable of leaving work entirely behind, even on the morning of her wedding. And she would have a mug of tea going cold on the nightstand, and she would underline something important in 3 different colors and not notice. He thought about the 14 months of building something true, something built from friction and honesty, and the specific pleasure of being genuinely known. "Yes," he said. She nodded. She looked down at the concrete floor. The moment had a texture to it now. Not quite grief, not quite relief, but the specific quality of a conversation that has arrived at its actual end. He let it breathe for a moment. Then he said, "I should tell you something." She looked up. "I knew this was possible," he said, "that you might come back. I've known it for years. Not certain, but probable. Based on everything I know about you and about Damien and about the way you navigate the world." She was very still. "I want you to know," he said, "that I made choices accordingly, not out of anger, not as punishment, as strategy." "What does that mean?" "It means," he said, "that the version of me you might have been imagining, the one with accumulated assets, a law practice, a real estate portfolio, the version you might have thought about in the abstract when things were going badly with Damien, that version doesn't exist in any form that you have access to." He said it without cruelty, clinically, the way you explain a legal structure to a client. "Everything I have is protected," he continued. "Not hidden, not fraudulently transferred. Protected. Legally, properly, with the full investment of my professional expertise. What I've built is inside a structure that took me 3 years and considerable precision to construct. and it is beyond the reach of anyone or anything that does not have my consent." She stared at him. I know you weren't necessarily thinking about it consciously," he said. "That's not an accusation. It's information." He paused. "I'm telling you because I think you deserve to know exactly where the parameters are, not as a threat, as clarity." The corridor hummed. The fluorescent lights continued their faint, indifferent buzz. Vivien looked at him for a long time, and then something in her expression settled. Not into defeat, exactly, but into a kind of recognition. Like someone who has been carrying a question for years and has just received an answer that was not what they hoped for, but was, at least, honest. "You built all of that," she said, "on the assumption that I would come back." "On the understanding that it was possible," he corrected, "and on the knowledge that I never again wanted to be a person whose stability was dependent on what someone else chose to do." She was quiet. Then, "She's lucky. She worked for it," he said. Like I worked for everything I have. That's different from luck." He took his hands out of his jacket pockets and straightened, the small physical signal of a conversation approaching its end. "I'm glad you came," he said. "Not for the reasons you might think, but because this conversation closes something. For you. Yes, for me." He didn't apologize for that. "I hope things get easier for you, Vivien. I mean that without performance." She nodded. She looked, in that moment, very human. Which was the thing about her that he had always found most difficult to dismiss. She was not a villain. She was simply someone who had made choices that cost him considerably, and who had now arrived, in the fluorescent light of a freight corridor, to find that the door she had left open was no longer a door. "The woman upstairs," Vivien said. "Does she know about me?" "Everything." The word seemed to reach her. She absorbed it. And then she looked at the gray wall and exhaled something that was not quite a sigh, but was in the territory. "I should go," she said. "Yes." She started toward the exit, the freight door at the corridor's far end, which opened to the service lane. Then she stopped, without turning around. A gesture he recognized. She had always done this. Stopped with something left to say. "If I hadn't left the first time," she said to the door, "would you be the same person?" He considered the question honestly. Thought about the law degree, the practice, the trust structure, the apartment with the floor-to-ceiling windows, the forensic accountant who asked questions that made him pause, the depot venue with the cedar and cold stone, the morning ahead of him that contained everything the morning after Vivien's first departure had seemed to have taken away. "No," he said. "I'd be considerably less." She stood with her back to him, and he watched her take that in. Then she pushed open the freight door, and the cold February air came through it for a moment, carrying the smell of the street, exhaust and damp pavement and something faintly metallic. And then the door swung closed, and she was gone. He stood in the corridor for approximately 45 seconds. Then he turned around and walked back toward the elevator, and his mind was already moving ahead. To the ceremony at 2, to the dinner afterward, to the specific problem he'd been working through mentally for a client whose estate had a complication around a disputed easement in the property boundary. A problem that was technically engaging and would resolve itself if you applied the right instrument to it. He pressed the elevator button. The doors opened. He stepped inside. The number above the door counted upward as he ascended. Lachlan found him in the bridal suite 40 minutes later, which was now functioning as Ethan's suite again. Dambo, and looked at him with the expression of someone who knew precisely what had happened and had decided, in the interest of the friendship, not to make a production of it. "Priya told me," Lachlan said. "Of course she did." "Was it?" "It was fine," Ethan said. He was sitting in the armchair by the window, jacket off, in his dress shirt and trousers, with the second cup of coffee of the morning going cooling on the table beside him and a file open in his lap that he was not reading. Lachlan sat on the edge of the ottoman across from him and was quiet for a moment, which was one of the things Ethan had always valued about him. The ability to be present without filling the space. "You knew she'd come?" Lachlan said. "I thought it was probable. Hence me mentioning it." "You told her the date and venue." "I mentioned the venue. She found the date herself," he paused. "I thought it was better for you to have the conversation on your timeline, on your ground." Ethan looked at him. That was well calibrated. Lachlan shrugged with the particular nonchalance of someone who is actually quite invested, but maintains the performance of indifference. "I've been running interference for you since second year of university. I know the terrain." He leaned forward, elbows on knees. "How is she?" "Diminished," Ethan said. Then, more carefully, "Not destroyed. But the version of her that existed on Damien's infrastructure doesn't have infrastructure anymore. She's recalibrating." "Did she ask for anything?" "No." "Did she want to?" He thought about the conversation, the corridor, the freight door, the cold air. "She wanted the door to still be open," he said. "She found out it wasn't." Lachlan absorbed this. "And?" "She left." A pause. "How do you feel?" Ethan considered the question with the same unhurried attention he gave all questions. He looked at the window, at the city below. The sanitation truck was gone. The woman with the enormous dog was gone. The bike courier was long gone. The street was filling with the mid-morning traffic of an ordinary Saturday. People moving through their ordinary days without knowledge of or interest in what was happening on the 14th floor of a converted railway depot, which was exactly how it should be. "Like I said earlier," he said. "Fine." Lachlan looked at him for a moment. "Ethan." "You can have a more complicated answer than fine." He was quiet. Then he said, "It closes something. That's the most accurate thing I can tell you. Not closure in the way people use the word, which is usually a euphemism for emotional resolution that never actually arrives. More like the last contractual obligation of a period of my life, a final signing, and now the document is complete and it can be filed. That's a very legal way to describe an emotional experience. Yes. Also accurate, knowing you. Yes." Lachlan sat back. He looked at the file in Ethan's lap. "Is that a client file?" "Easement dispute. On your wedding morning." "The client is in litigation. Deadlines don't care about my personal schedule." Lachlan made the face he had been making at Ethan for 15 years, the face that communicated simultaneous exasperation and deep affection. Then he reached over and, without ceremony, took the file from Ethan's lap and set it on the table next to the coffee. "Toi. The client can wait 4 hours," he said. "You're getting married." Ethan looked at the table where the file now sat. Then he looked at Lachlan. "I am getting married," he agreed. Lachlan's expression broke open into the wide, uncomplicated grin that Ethan associated specifically with him. The grin that had been one of the handful of consistent, reliable things in 2 decades of his life. "And she is extraordinary," Lachlan said. "Celeste, she's Ethan. She's the first woman I've met where I thought, yes, this is someone who's genuinely his match. Not because she's like him, because she sees him accurately." Ethan was quiet. "You know what she said to me at the rehearsal dinner?" Lachlan continued. "She said he's built better than anyone I've met, but I don't think he knows it yet." He paused. "She's right, by the way." Ethan looked at the window. "I know it," he said. "I'm just careful about demonstrating it." "Less careful," Lachlan said. Today. It's your wedding day. The ceremony was at 2. The depot had transformed over the morning into something that was, without being ostentatious, genuinely beautiful. The bare branch arrangements that had replaced the white orchids had given everything a structural honesty, the kind of beauty that doesn't apologize for itself and doesn't perform. The reclaimed timber walls held the afternoon light in a way that made the space feel simultaneously vast and intimate. A string quartet was positioned near the entrance, playing something Ethan didn't recognize, but was quietly glad was not the standard repertoire. He stood at the front, beside the officiant, a retired judge named Harrow, who Ethan had worked with on 3 separate estate litigation cases, and who had agreed to officiate with the specific, dry warmth of a man who takes ceremony seriously without taking himself too seriously. And he looked at the assembled guests. 62 people. He had wanted a small number, quality over mass, people who actually knew him, rather than people who felt they should be present. Lachlan stood to his right, wearing a suit that was slightly better than usual, which Ethan appreciated. The string quartet shifted into something else, something slower and more deliberate, and the doors at the far end of the depot opened. Celeste walked in on her own. No procession, no arm to hold. She had told him, 6 weeks before the wedding, Tata, that she wanted to walk herself in. "I'm not being transferred," she'd said without heat, as a simple statement of fact. "I'm arriving." He had said, "Obviously." She wore something that was neither the white of tradition nor the deviation of someone making a statement about not caring for tradition. It was a cream so deep it was almost the color of aged paper, and it was structured and simple, and managed somehow to be both elegant and unsentimental. Her hair was down. She was wearing earrings he'd never seen before, small geometric things in matte gold. She walked with the gait of a person who is comfortable in their own body, not performing grace, but simply inhabiting it. As she covered the length of the depot, she looked at the guests without nervousness, and then, when she had covered enough ground, she looked at him. She looked at him with the same expression she'd been using for 14 months. The one that read past the sentence to the paragraph underneath. The one that saw, with the precision of someone trained in forensic analysis, what was actually there. He looked back, and he let her look. He let himself be seen, which was the thing he had been learning, slowly and with considerable difficulty, to do. She arrived beside him. She smelled like the specific cedar and clean linen of the product she used on her hair, and like the faintest trace of the tea she'd had that morning. And like herself. Ordinary, irreplaceable. She leaned slightly toward him, the smallest possible movement. "You okay?" she said, barely audible. Not a performance, just direct. He thought about the fluorescent corridor, the freight door, the cold air, the woman who had made him into what he was by taking what he had, and who had arrived too late to find anything she could reach. He thought about the Asset Protection Trust, the holding companies, the family limited partnership, the precise, invisible architecture of a life he had built so that no one could reach it without his consent. He thought about the client with the easement dispute, which he would solve on Monday morning, and the new case he had coming in Wednesday, and the building in the River District he was planning to acquire through the LP next quarter. He thought about Celeste asking her question at the seminar. The pause he'd had to take before answering, the text message, "Make it lunch." He thought about the ordinary things, the sanitation truck, and the yellow coat, and the enormous dog, and the indifferent city running its ordinary routes with no interest in the specific architecture of his life. He looked at her. Her eyes were steady. They were always steady. "Yes," he said. Judge Harrow cleared his throat. The string quartet concluded their piece and let the silence settle. And Ethan Mercer, standing in the cold stone and cedar air of the morning he had built his way toward, let the silence settle too. The reception ran until past 10. The depot's ambient sound shifted over the evening from the clean quiet of ceremony to the warmer, looser texture of people who have eaten and drunk well and are now operating in the register of genuine enjoyment rather than social performance. Ethan moved through the room with the controlled ease of a host who has planned the details sufficiently well to not need to manage them in real time, and he drank moderately and spoke with the people who mattered to him and did not check his phone, and did not, at any point, think about Vivien Hale in the fluorescent corridor. He did not think about her because the conversation had been its own kind of filing, the document signed and stored. It was not that it was over. It had been over for years, in all the ways that mattered, but the conversation had made it official in some way that was useful for completeness. Celeste found him near the bar area sometime around 9, where he was in a conversation with one of his clients, a developer who had become something close to a friend over 3 years of successfully navigating a complex estate dispute, and she appeared beside him with her hand briefly at the small of his back. The lightest possible contact, just confirmation. He introduced her. Ta-Troyam. The client shook her hand and said something about Ethan's professional reputation that was complimentary and not excessive, and Celeste received it with the polite efficiency of a person who does not require flattery to know their own worth. When the client moved away, they stood together briefly in the particular quiet that good company generates between people who do not require constant filling of silence. "Your coordinator," Celeste said. "Priya." "Yes." "She's very good." "She is. She also has the expression of someone who has been not telling me something all day." He was quiet for a moment. "I had a conversation this morning with someone from a long time ago. I didn't tell you before the ceremony because I didn't want the ceremony to carry that weight." Celeste looked at him with the same level, reading attention she always brought to complicated information. "Dicker, was it necessary?" "Yes." "Is it over?" "Yes." She considered this for a moment. She picked up her glass from the bar and turned it slightly in her hand, a thinking gesture. Then she said, "You can tell me later. All of it. I want to know." "I'll tell you everything." "Good." She looked at the room, at the guests moving through the warm, amber light of the converted depot. "I read 3 case files this morning, before the ceremony." "I know. I saw the tote bag." She gave him the sideways look that was her version of a laugh. "I found something in the Brennan case that I think you should know about. There's a trust structure discrepancy that intersects with your work on the underlying property." "Tell me tomorrow." "I'll tell you now because if I don't—" "Celeste." She stopped. "It's our wedding," he said. "The Brennan case will be there Monday." She looked at him for a moment. Then she made a sound that was absolutely her laugh. "Takarm," the one that arrived without warning. "Right, yes, you're correct." She put her glass down. "Dance with me." He did not dance. He had not danced at any previous event in his adult life, and had not intended to dance at this one. He looked at her. She looked back. He took her hand. They danced for exactly 1 song, which was a decent negotiation. He was not technically skilled, but he was coordinated, and he moved with the particular physical competence of a man who understands spatial relationships, and it was not embarrassing. She laughed twice during it, once when he misjudged a turn, and once for no reason he could identify. He did not mind. Afterward, they stood at the edge of the dance floor, and she leaned into his side, and he looked out at the room. His guests, his depot, his cedar and cold stone and spare branch centerpieces. Tiwa, his extraordinarily precise wife, who had her own case files and her own forensic mind, and would not be managed, not today or any day, and who saw him accurately, and did it without requirement. A server passed with a tray and offered them something that Ethan declined, and Celeste took, a small pastry of some kind, and she held it up and looked at it with the investigative attention she brought to everything, and then ate it and said, without looking at him, "It has cardamom." "How do you know that from one bite?" "I'm forensic," she said. "It's cardamom." He looked at her. "Also," she said, "I asked the pastry chef earlier." He felt in his chest the warm, unspectacular, reliable pressure of something that had been built carefully from honest materials and was holding exactly as engineered. It was not what he had imagined love to feel like at 26, but 26 had been wrong about many things. So, he took her hand again. The depot hummed with the ordinary sounds of people who were happy. Somewhere in the city below, the night was doing its ordinary work. Somewhere there was a woman in a green coat making her way through it. He did not know which direction she had walked when she left through the freight door, and he did not need to. Celeste squeezed his hand once, without looking at him, which was the language of someone who did not make a production of what was real. He squeezed back. By 11, the last guests were moving toward the exits in the warm, slightly blurred way of people who have been well-fed and well-entertained, and Ethan was standing near the entrance exchanging the final quiet words with the retiring judge, who shook his hand and said, with the dry precision that characterized everything about him, "You're a difficult man to surprise. I hope she manages it occasionally." Ethan thought about the cardamom. "She does," he said. When the judge was gone, he found Priya doing a final sweep of the event space, tablet in hand, making notes with the focused efficiency of someone who is already 3 steps into next task mode. He walked over to her. "Priya." She looked up. "You handled this morning well," he said. She gave him the look of a professional who receives acknowledgement without requiring it, but appreciates its accuracy. "The orchids were a mistake," she said. "I should have confirmed the florals with you earlier." "The orchids were fine. I meant the other thing." She held his gaze for a moment. "She was polite," Priya said neutrally, "and she left without incident." "Yes." "Does Celeste know?" "She will." Priya made a small nod, the kind that communicates confidence in the management of a situation without expressing an opinion on it. She went back to her tablet. "Everything will be cleared by 6 a.m. tomorrow morning. The trust handled the final payment. No paperwork outstanding." "Thank you." She moved away toward the catering team, and he turned and looked at the room, nearly empty now, the servers clearing the last of the tables, the string quartet gone, the bare branches in their geometric arrangements standing in the amber light with the kind of simplicity that does not diminish when the crowd leaves. He thought, briefly and completely, about the thing he had told Vivien in the corridor, that if she hadn't left the first time, he would be considerably less. It was true, not as a performance of generosity, not as a consolation he was offering her or himself. Simply as a structural fact, the man who had been standing in that apartment at 26 with a glass of the wrong lipstick on the counter was not the man who stood in this depot tonight. The version who had been broken had been rebuilt with better materials. The loss had been the catalyst for every subsequent choice. The law degree, the specialization, the trust structure, the practice, the floor-to-ceiling windows, the forensic accountant who used 4 colors of ink. Vivien had not given him these things. She had simply removed what was preventing him from building them. He found Celeste at the far end of the depot, standing near the window that looked east. She had taken her shoes off and was standing in her stockinged feet on the concrete floor, holding her glass, looking at the city. The cream of her dress had acquired over the evening the slightly warmer quality of something worn through a real day rather than a curated one. He walked to her, stood beside her, looked at the city. "Tell me," she said. He did. Not all at once. It was not that kind of story, the kind that compresses into a single telling. but the shape of it, the essential architecture. The woman, the 2 departures, the second engagement, the law degree, the years of building. The trust structure and what it meant. The corridor that morning and what had been said in it, and what had been understood. Celeste listened with the complete forensic attention she gave to all information that mattered. She did not interrupt. She looked at the city through the glass, occasionally, and then back at him, and he could see her processing not just the facts, but the structure underneath. Lachlan, the way a forensic accountant sees a financial document, not just the numbers, but the architecture of what the numbers represent. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "The Domestic Asset Protection Trust. Which jurisdiction?" "Nevada." She nodded slowly. "Charging order protection is absolute there. Single-member LLC interest isn't attachable." "Correct." "And the timing of the transfer?" 3 years and 4 months before tonight. Well outside any applicable fraudulent transfer window." She considered. "The family limited partnership general partner interest in the corporate entity. Wholly owned by the trust. So a charging order against the LP interest yields nothing but suspended rights. No actual control." "No actual control," he confirmed. She was quiet again. Then she said, very quietly, "You built it like a building. Load-bearing walls nobody can see. That's what good structural engineering looks like." She turned to look at him directly. Her expression was one he hadn't seen before. Not surprise, exactly, but the particular quality of a person who has been looking at something from one angle and has just found the angle that reveals the full dimension. "You were ready for every version of this," she said. "I prepared for the most probable ones." "And me?" He looked at her. "You were not in the preparation," he said. "You arrived after all of that was complete, which is why it's different." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she looked back at the city, and something in her expression settled into the warm, uncomplicated quality of someone who has received information and is simply keeping it, adding it to the record. "The cardamom pastry chef," she said, "told me the recipe is his grandmother's." "Is that relevant?" "No," she said. I just liked the information." He looked at her. She was looking at the city with that half-expression that he had 14 months of evidence to read, the one that meant she was thinking about several things at once, and would tell him the interesting ones, and keep the others for her own ledger. He did not need to know all of them. He knew enough. He knew what was load-bearing. He looked at the city with her. Below, the ordinary world continued its ordinary midnight work. The lights of the financial district, the distant current of the highway, the slow and indifferent passage of the city through another night. Somewhere out there, the freight door of the depot service lane opened onto a street that opened onto the broader geography of a city that contained, among its millions of people, one woman in a green coat who was now simply another person moving through it, unconnected to the architecture of his life. The city did not notice. The city was not interested. He reached over and took Celeste's hand, the same light grip from the dance floor, the one she had returned without production. She didn't look at him. She was still looking at the city. "I'm going to want the full legal memo on the Nevada trust structure," she said, "for my own understanding." "Monday," he said. "Sunday." "Fine," he said. "Sunday." She squeezed his hand once. He looked at the city. The depot hummed behind them, the last servers completing their quiet work, and the branches in their geometric arrangements stood in the dimming amber light, and the cold stone and cedar held the air the way honest materials always hold things, without performance, without the need for applause, simply by being precisely what they were built to be.